the recorder. Uh, I record all these sessions, and then at the end of the night, after Zoom takes its sweet time converting them, I throw them up on YouTube and put a link up on As You Learn to the session. In general, because of the way these classes are structured, one at 5:30 and another one kind of right behind it at 7:30, I will probably, maybe an hour, hour and a half, about an hour and a half will be most of the length of the synchronous meetings we have. So that'll, it'll be a one-piece recording as opposed to two parts to it or something like that. I've had to make one alteration already to the schedule, and I apologize for having to do that. We originally had scheduled to meet tonight, skip next week, and meet the week after next, but I'm going to have to flip the next 2 weeks. I'm going to have to schedule a meeting for next week, and then we'll skip the week after that. And by next week, I should have a pretty good idea of what my schedule looks like, and sort of where all the different meetings and groups and things like that I've had to, fit into my schedule this semester. I'm teaching 3 graduate classes. I've got 3 dissertations I'm chairing, including one that has to be done here in a couple of months. And the other 2 have to be finished by the end of the year. And then I'm on half a dozen other committees or so like that. And so it's turning into a very busy semester, even without sort of some of the other issues that are going on kind of in our home life right now. So once I get a schedule worked out, which I hope to have by next week, I'll be able to give you the schedule for the entire semester, or at least for a good part of the semester. I don't imagine that we will meet back-to-back weeks all that much after we get through these first couple of weeks and I get you going. It will probably meet every other week, or that'll kind of the pattern I'm thinking about, but it may even differ from there depending on kind of how schedule looks further on down the line for the semester. The idea is that most of the work happens on your end, and I'm a big believer in what I call discovery learning and mastery learning, and I think that you kind of learn best what you discover, and there's a certain level of aggravation and hopefully not frustration, but aggravation with that. And as you kind of work through stuff, hopefully it'll be work a little bit better for you. I don't try to tell you exactly 100% how things should go, how you should do things, and how you should approach things. There is a structure to the class, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I do value, people expressing their own creativity as how they go about some things. And there are only 2 or 3 rules, and we'll talk about okay, who can't hear me? Caitlin? Okay. Hold on just a second. Okay. Um, Hopefully everything will work out as we go along for a schedule. So we'll, as I say, I'll try to pin that down by next week. Tonight we'll kind of lay out some general stuff, and we'll also kind of walk through the syllabus and walk through the outline for the semester project. The other kind of philosophical approach I take to a class like this is I'm a strong believer in sort of a mastery learning model, supported with an authentic assessment approach at the end. And so everything that we will do will be in a logical sort of sequence leading up to a project at the end, and the different pieces, the elements of the project will kind of add as we go along. And so there will be, the project in and of itself will involve a lot of different iterations as we go along. But it is each of the individual projects folds or adds or sets the basis for the next stage and the next stage and the next stage and the next stage. And so the general rule is, do those things that I ask you to do, submit them on time so I can give you feedback, and we can keep the process moving along. And then, respond to the feedback, and the next iteration, which will probably have a new piece added into it also, the next iteration will include, fixes to the previous elements, and then, that iteration, and I'll look at that one and give you feedback, and we'll go throughout the course. So there'll probably be about 4 or 5 feedbacks, 4 or 5 opportunities for feedback as we go along. I do not necessarily assign a grade to each one of those. I assign credit. And what happens at the end is that the authentic assessment is really the measure of how well you do in the course, but that's, it's kind of a real life sort of an approach. But you'll get lots of feedback as we go along. So there's, when you get to the end, you'll have had several cycles of feedback and at least one complete iteration that I will respond to before you have to turn in the final project. Examples, once we get going in the course a little bit, and you kind of make some decisions about what you're going to look at, and you begin to look at a little bit of a lit review piece and all those pieces, then I'll provide you with some examples. But I try not to do that up front because I don't want you to limit it by what other people have done or what the approach that other people took to something, because I do value sort of your individual creativity as you go along as much as possible. And I'm sure you have lots of questions as we get into the outline and we get into the syllabus, but I just like to lay all that stuff out front. A little bit about me, just so you know who you're dealing with. This is my 41st year in higher education, and I've for the last 11 years I've been here at App. A couple of years prior to that, I was a VP for institutional effectiveness and director of institutional research at a community college for a couple of years. And then prior to that, I spent almost 30 years at James Madison University on faculty, and I was a department head for 5 years, and then I was also a interim associate dean for what was supposed to be a semester and ended up being 2 years. So and various other roles at the university, but mostly faculty, and except for those periods of time. Done a lot of grants, done a lot of project-funded projects and evaluation of grants and projects and programs and things like that. So my field is really research and evaluation. This is what I do. I do research methodology, statistics, evaluation, assessment, all those areas. And so that's kind of what I've taught and what most of my outside consulting activities and scholarly work have been focused on for a long time now. Prior to the 41 years in higher ed, I was 5 years in public schools as a secondary school teacher and a coach. So, I guess for the last 46 years, I've been doing nothing but education. So that didn't sound good, nothing but for the last 46 years, I've been doing education. I guess that's what I meant to say. And so I have some experience in these matters, I guess is what I'm trying to say. My PhD is in research and evaluation from the University of Virginia. 35 years ago, I guess it was. So it's been a while. But that's the guy you're dealing with. That's what you're getting into. Okay. Any comments or questions before we maybe take a look at the syllabus and go from there? Okay. Well, let me get it queued up here so I can get to it. Okay. All right. Let me share the syllabus out. You've probably got it in front of you anyhow, but okay. Ignore the dates, obviously, in doing, updates and things like that. They're all going to change after the first couple here. Well, actually, the first three are probably correct, but everything else will, may be changed. We don't know quite yet. And so we'll kind of go from there. The best way to reach me is by email. You have my phone number, my cell number, or my only phone number. I don't only have one number these days. And so, if you need to call me, you can. If you, best way is probably to do email first, though, and I'll respond to email quickly. I check my email virtually anytime I'm awake. And, I'm an old guy, so I don't sleep all that much. So I'm checking my email first thing in the morning, late at night, middle of the night, middle of the day, whatever. So it's the best way to get me, and I'll try to respond as quickly as possible. And if I know it's going to be a while, I'll let you know. I'll get back to you, tomorrow morning or this evening or something like that. But I'll let you know what's happening. And as I say, there is telephone number. If we need to meet, you want to meet kind of visual to visual, I would say face to face, but it's not face to face, then we'll use Zoom as a conference. If you want to be old fashioned, we can even do something like a phone call. I think those are still allowed anymore, but Zoom adds another element to it that's sometimes useful. There are a couple of purposes for this course. And, I want to, talk about those briefly. One is that we are trying to get you to be maybe a little bit better consumer of the research that's out there, the research that's around you. It is, we live in a world in which, we're constantly updating, we're constantly, working on what's the next thing, or how do we improve this, or how do we improve that. And so in that process, there's a need to understand the research that's out there and understand, what people are telling us based on their experiences and based on the research that they've done. And so being able to kind of look at the literature that's out there, look at that research and all that it is important to be able to consume that in such a way that we need to have an understanding of what it's really saying. And the second purpose is to help you develop some very rudimentary, very basic sort of notions about research and notions about how to use research methodologies and perhaps some basic research skills to answer questions in your professional setting, or to be able to know more about what you're doing and know more about what might work better for you. And so that that notion is really kind of a vital part of the purpose of this course too, to help you develop these skills. Now, in this course, this Research 5000 course, we offer it for a variety of programs, and we try to tailor the individual course offerings to the particular programs that we're working with. And since this is mostly library science and media services or media sciences, I guess, then what we would hope to do, and what we have done, is to, instead of requiring you to do sort of a research, one of those generic sort of research prospectus ideas, is to do a school improvement plan that uses, or an institutional or organizational improvement plan that uses research methodology and research ideas and sort of basic tenets of that to help you understand, what might be working or what might not be working with an intervention or with some sort of project or program that you're thinking about implementing or trying to implement. And this is a plan. It's not, you don't actually end up doing this within the frame of this course, but it doesn't really stop you from taking as your focus something that you might actually be interested in working on in your professional setting. And so if you want to take a look at your school or your institution's improvement plan and adopt some element of that, or if you want to take a look at some, new notion or cutting edge idea that's out there that might improve the delivery of education or services at your particular school or institution, feel free, because even though you won't be necessarily implementing in this course, we'll try to get you a plan developed enough that you could, if you wanted to, put it into action and actually implement. So we wanted to be as best fit as possible for your purposes. Now, there's a lot of stuff in here about what we hope to occur and course objectives. And if you look at the objectives, you'll see they kind of play out across the two basic purposes: one, becoming a better consumer of research, and one, developing some rudimentary understanding and skills related to research. The course expectations, it is graduate coursework. I won't necessarily hold your hand and walk you through it. We will, you are, I'm hoping to see the sort of creativity and activity that you would expect to see from grad students, and that have a commitment to the program and a commitment to the ideas. And so what we would like to see is that you embrace the course and engage in the course. And, that's the, kind of the very least of the expectations. And then obviously there are more expectations beyond that. The assignments, all of which will be focused around, with the exception of the narrative. I have not read the narrative yet. I'm getting ready to, some of those have been posted, not all of them, but I'm getting ready to get into those this weekend. So once I look at the narratives, I'll obviously check those off. But it helps me to understand better who I'm dealing with. And in this sort of online environment, that becomes a problem, becomes an issue. And so, I would like to know better kind of what's going on. All assignments will be posted in As You Learn. There'll be a link to post everything, and plenty of access to those links. So if you need a, by that I mean they will take multiple files, but we're not really interested in multiple files. It just allows you to load a little bit bigger file if you want to. We want everything in 12-point font, double spaced. Once again, I need to be able to read it, and we're kind of moving in the direction of APA format, even at the beginning. So as much as possible, 12-point, double spaced. Anything that you may have submitted so far, don't worry about, but obviously going forward. We'll worry more about APA the deeper we get into the course. The more we get into multiple iterations, and the APA part becomes a bigger deal. But we'll just kind of have to see how that goes. There are 3 major sections, and we'll talk more. These will be outlined a little bit more in the project outline. And so when we get to the project outline, we'll talk a little bit more about this. But there are 3 major sections. One is problem statement or area of improvement. What is it that you hope to do? And, why is that an important thing to do? What's the context of it? What do we know about it? All those things. The lit review, it's important to understand what other research, what other things have been done out there, and therefore we need to have you engage in a little bit of lit review. There won't be a whole lot of sources, maybe 8 to 10 sources, and there'll be some structure of that, and we'll kind of lay the structure out for you. And then the research design, the implementation. And so how will you actually do this, and what data will we collect, and all those sorts of things. And no required text. Everything that you need to read that I want, resources I want to give you, I'll put up on As You Learn. Obviously, if you have other resources you want to bring into the mix, that's fine. But no required text. You get to spend your $150 on something else. And you can read the evaluation and grading piece, but the important piece is this very last piece. Please note that in keeping with mastery learning philosophy, your grade can normally be no higher or lower than the grade on the final performance measure. So basically, we're working to lead up to that final authentic assessment piece. You will have done multiple iterations. I will have reviewed and given you feedback on at least one complete iteration. And so it's the final submission is basically just fixing anything that's wrong. And so I have no problem at all with 8 A's for the course. There's always somebody or occasionally there's somebody that finds a way to screw that up. But it really is 3 basic rules: do what I ask you to do, get it in on time, follow the timeline, and take the feedback. Feedback is always constructive. It's not designed to be, in any way personally directed or anything. It's just feedback. And so, take the feedback and respond to it in a constructive way. Follow those 3 rules, do the things I ask you to do, and everything will be fine. We'll get to the end of the course and you will have had a good experience. And then there's a course outline here. We will not cover all this. This is basically everything that you might want to include in a fundamental research course. And it may or may not, we'll pick and choose what we put in there. So, we just have to kind of look at it. Any questions about the syllabus? No questions, no concerns, no worries, no thoughts. Good. All right, let's look at the project outline. Once again, let me get this queued up so it'll be there. If I appear not to be looking at you, I'm kind of off to the side or whatever, I have 3 monitors going here. And so as I shift back and forth, I may be staring over there. I'll try to stay as close as focused on the camera in front of me as possible. The department thought it was important that we have better AV, better equipment, so they bought us these really nice 1080 HD cameras to put on our laptops, to mount on our laptops for these classes. I'm not sure you're going to want me 1080 HD the entire semester, but you know, particularly if it's one of those days that I haven't shaved in a day or two. So we'll, if you come online and the resolution's down a little bit, don't worry about it. It's just I've switched back to the other camera for that session. But anyhow, it's scary when you get old. You start seeing yourself in 1080 HD, but that's life, I guess. Okay, here is the outline for the school improvement project. It's organized very similar to what a research prospectus might be organized, although the topics are tailored to be somewhat different. You'll notice that it does include the APA elements, title page, table of contents, table of charts and displays, things like that. Obviously, we won't worry about that early on, but by the time we get into the middle iterations of the course or whatever, we will begin to get more serious about APA, and I'll start giving you some feedback on that as we go along too. The first section, problem statement, area of improvement, has 3 general sections to it, 3 general pieces to it. And the thing you're working on now in terms of a description or a brainstorming activity will begin to form the basis of this. What is this intervention? What is this thing that you might want to look at? If you've got multiple thoughts about that, then you by all means use 2 or 3, but give me more than an idea. Give me a paragraph or so about each. If you have just one, that's fine. But I know some folks have said they might have a couple of ideas or things like that. 8 or 10 might be too much, but a couple of 3 is okay. Just give me a little bit more than 1 sentence. Give me sort of a paragraph on things. That will eventually begin to morph into this introduction, or as we call it, the context of the deficit, which includes a description of the community. What's the setting in which this intervention or project will take place in? Is it is it a rural area? Is it a urban area? Is it a small school? Is it a big school? Is it a school that has high poverty index? Is it a school with Title I funding? Those things that help to describe the community that the school comes from within. And then if there's any data, local data or versus comparative data, that will provide some context for the reason for doing this particular intervention or this particular project or this particular improvement, you certainly will eventually include that. For example, are scores in a particular school or a particular program different from the rest of the school or other schools or the division or the state or whatever? What is the context of the improvement? And then once we get kind of past that, and this will be probably the next components of the second iteration. Once we take this idea that you've started and begin to flesh it out a little bit. we'll add some thoughts about that. Eventually, we will be adding improvement goals, definitions of key terms, and impact on the school community or the organization community. In other words, if they do this improvement and it's effective, what impact will it have on students and parents and teachers and administrators and all the stakeholders that are involved in that particular community or that particular school. While this is being developed, simultaneously you will also be kind of working on the lit review piece. And I think you can see how these two things might be interactive. You do the lit review in order to understand what we know about something based on what other people have done with it, or what we've learned based on research that's already out there. And you do the lit review to learn from other people in terms of, how do they go about doing this? How do they go about implementing this? What were the problems they ran into, and what were the issues that they had in doing that? And so, that sort of notion will begin to emerge from the literature, and it will influence how you write some of these pieces. So the process will be semi-simultaneous as we go through here. We obviously have to start somewhere, so we'll start up here. But as we go along, you'll find that this begins to inform this first section. Now, that leads into the second major section, which is the lit review itself. There'll be some assumptions you make. I mean, you're going to look at literature related to a particular idea, a particular program, particular type school, a typical, particular size school, whatever the limitations you're kind of putting on the lit review. Now, I caution you to be careful about proprietary literature that's developed by people that are also selling a program. Yeah, it's not surprising that it's often self-serving. And so I encourage you to find literature that has some basis in maybe professional journals or conference notes or things like that as you go about looking for them. Because that may tell you more and be more meaningful in what it tells you than the proprietary stuff. Then you'll do the actual lit review, 8 to 10 sources, in which you'll try to make connections or try to draw some assumptions or try to, look to see if what the sort of state of affairs is around that particular idea or that particular intervention. And then that will lead to what we, for lack of a better term, will call a conceptual framework, which is really what is it you expect to see if you implement this and it's successful? What do you expect to find? What will this project inform in terms of the overall understanding of the success of this particular intervention or implementation? And then once all that comes together, and there's a couple of 2 or 3 iterations here, then we get to the research design piece, which has to do with, okay, how would we actually go about doing this? How would we implement this? What's the overall theory of action? I mean, and at this point, we'll engage in kind of the exercise of logic modeling. And I know that some of you have had exposure to logic modeling. And so we'll engage in that, and based on the process of logic modeling, which is akin to backwards planning, which you may be familiar with in schools. But that'll bring us into a theory of action, which will build backwards from outcomes to activities to accomplish those outcomes, to resources needed to support those activities. We plan it backwards, we implement it forwards. Sources of data, where will we get the data that we need to understand how well this intervention is doing, outcomes from it, what outcomes will be measured, what data we'll use to measure them, data collection, how we'll go about doing that, and how we analyze it. Now, once we get into sources of data, and I want you to kind of keep this in the back of your mind as much as possible, the data that we will try to have you plan to collect, even though you won't collect it during the frame of this course. The tendency is to want to go with summative data, the stuff you see at the end of the year, end of a course, end of a semester, whatever, the summative stuff. That tells you something. What it can't tell you, though, is what impact a particular intervention or a particular project may have had on that summative outcome. Because there's so much stuff going on in the school, there's so many factors, there's so many variables running around, that it generally takes more than one of those to have a summative impact. And it's really hard to kind of assign impact to one of those things or to one particular project. So I'll encourage you to think about and try to find shorter term outcomes that can be measured on a short-term basis that are particular to that particular intervention or project. And those then will form the basis for the most information you can gather about an intervention or a particular project. So this is the outline. We'll keep coming back to this over and over and over again as we move along. We will approach it in a sequential fashion, so there's no need to get, kind of have it all absorbed at once. And as we get into it and get engaged a little bit more, then I'll provide some examples, some exemplars. But I kind of resist that until we kind of get you going on it, and that way you have the opportunity for to display some creativity. Questions about the project? It's getting dark in here. So if you'll excuse me a moment, I'm going to turn on a light or two. And get this big chair back in the way here so that light over my shoulder doesn't drown out the room. I think I need to do something about that, but I'll work on it. This is an entirely new configuration for me in this room. I had it on another wall, and I had a window across the room that just drowned everything out in the afternoon because it faces west. And now I have it, my back is facing southeast. So hopefully it should be better. And there's no window over there. Of course, there's that big old light. Alexa, turn on Den. That may help. Yes, my house is Alexa all over. And controls the lights, it controls the thermostats. Doorbell, whatever. It drives my wife nuts, but even she's beginning to adapt to it. She can change the thermostat on her own whenever she feels like it, just by talking to Alexa. We have the constant battle back and forth between thermostats, so I like it colder. She likes it hotter. So what can you say? All right. Any thoughts or questions about any of that? What the expectations, the assignments, that sort of stuff? All right. I'm going to do a quick little introduction to a couple of the course ideas here in a second. But first, a personal aside, I appreciate your thoughts about what we're kind of going through as a family a little bit. It looks like we're at a good point. It looks like that prognosis is very positive, and leave it to my 33-year-old lawyer son to have an extremely rare tumor that nobody has seen in 20 or 30 years. So we did find a hospital, Johns Hopkins, who's I guess one of the preeminent ones in the country. It's only 3 hours from here, so it's drivable, and they seem to know what they're doing, and the prognosis is very positive. So we're being optimistic about the whole thing. You think when you have kids that, when they get to be 18 or 21 or actually get a real job, you don't worry about them as much. Well, actually, you worry about them more because they're no longer under your control, and so you can't control what goes on in their life. And so I guess you're kind of he's single and he lives with us. We got this huge big old house, and so he has his space over in the corner. It's all to himself and all that sort of stuff. So he's his mom and I are his support system right now, and we'll be there. But anyhow, I think that it will not impact this course or my delivery of instruction or anything like that. But just in case I do seem slightly more distracted than usual, that's probably the case. But once again, thanks for your thoughts, and I think we're at a good point. All right, research. You probably have some notion when you think about research as to what's in your mind, and it may be, old white guys in lab coats, or, mice running around, or, in cages, or stuff like that. As it turns out, research is a very different process. It's the notions of empiricism go back, a couple of thousand years, if not more, maybe 2,500 years or so. And most of what had been done until the last couple hundred years was what we would call, using a system of logic that we would call inductive logic. And inductive logic essentially says, let's collect a lot of information. Let's gather as much stuff as we can. And once we have a big well of information, let's see if there's something we can learn from it. Let's see if there's a truth in there that we can learn from all this information. And it's a kind of a slow process. It doesn't, the pace of inquiry is slow. It doesn't get there very fast. And once this sort of inductive notion was developed by the Greeks back 2,500 years ago, so it lay dormant for a long time, because beginning, the first millennium and a half of, kind of the modern era, I guess, the world was in darkness. The world was in truly the dark ages, because science was not an activity that the major force in the world, at least in Western Europe at the time, the Holy Roman Catholic Church, it didn't sanction science. Science was not something that it wanted. And they didn't want inquiry. They didn't want, basically they didn't want people to know much at all. And so it probably in those dark ages, it was mainly because the curtains have been drawn by the church as to, what people were allowed to know or what they should know. And then beginning in about the 14th century or so, there was, the cracks began to occur, partially because the Islamic influences and the Arabic influences began to emerge into Spain and parts of Western Europe across the Straits of Gibraltar. And after the inevitable battles of the Crusades and things like that, the two basic cultures began to interact a bit. And one of the things about the Arabic culture is that they valued learning, and they valued art, and they valued language, and they valued literature, and they valued all those things. And so when they took over a good portion of the sort of Greek Empire at the time, when Alexander the Great died, and those elements of the Greek Empire that were on the eastern part of the Mediterranean began to fall apart, they were overrun by Arabic influences. And sort of the Arabs took all that knowledge in. They took all that Greek information in, and they archived it. They kept it. They learned from it. A lot of the early sciences, early things we understand about math and science and physics and all like that actually come from Arabic culture and not from Roman culture or from Roman Catholic Church cultures. The Romans didn't care about any of that. They basically destroyed all those things. They didn't want those libraries. They weren't interested in art or learning or literature or poetry or any of that stuff. They wanted to build things. And so, they built stuff. But all these influences were retained in the Arabic cultures. And, when the Arabic cultures became mainly Islamic, the Islamic notions also valued those ideas. And so as they spread across northern Africa in the first millennium, last half of the first millennium, and then eventually emerged into Spain, they brought all these Greek ideas, this inductive, this empirical notion, this inductive logic notion and all, reemerged into Europe beginning 13th, 14th century. And you saw this flourishment of knowledge and learning and science between, basically the latter part of the 14th century into the early part of the 19th century. But with the industrial age came some other issues. And this fairly slow science, this fairly inductive model, it took a long time for the inductive way to do research to actually bear fruit. The understanding of the motions of the planets that changed the whole idea of the Earth being at the center of the universe to the fact we're part of a solar system that's kind of a minor star on the edge of a totally mediocre galaxy. That idea came about as a result of 40 years of observation. People going up on a rooftop and observing the stars and the planets and how they moved and, all those things. Theory of evolution, Darwin. It took 15 years of research, 15 years of gathering information for those notions to begin to evolve and to begin to crystallize. And so, most everything that we've learned that was important, basic science stuff, had been learned through the inductive model up until the early part of the 19th century. And by about the middle of the 19th century, it became very apparent, early middle part, became apparent that wouldn't get us there, that we needed a better science to kind of deal with the technology and the industrial revolution and all those things. And so a new type of science emerged called modern scientific method at the time. It's deductive science. Science based on a hypothesis that leads to a prediction, that leads to the development of a research model, that leads to the conduct of the research, collection of data, analysis of results. And so instead of taking years and years and years and years of just collecting data, this modern scientific method looked at data in very specific terms and very much shorter time frames. And so the pace of science, the pace of discovery, the pace of inquiry exploded, and is still exploding today, primarily because of a lot of advances brought about by this modern scientific method. But by the early 20th century, we began to realize that, you know, it wasn't enough to say, you know, we can do this. We needed to understand whether we should do it or not, whether it was important and what impact it would have on people. And so we had, you know, different social science movements developing. We had the feminist movement beginning to develop, suffrage movement, all of those things developing, and we needed a better science to understand the sort of the impact of those and to understand what the questions were. How did we get at the questions that we needed to answer? And that led to a new inductive model, one that was much more confined, dealing with a very small amount of subjects in a very, you know, limited space, limited sort of setting, and looking at guiding questions and not just collecting information. And that ended up being what we now call qualitative research. The modern scientific method is quantitative research. And in the last middle to latter part of the 20th century, there was a big debate about which was better, which was more appropriate. The folks that did qualitative research said, well, you know, these guys that do quantitative research, they do that because they can't work with real people. They don't want to work with real people. And the folks that did the quantitative research said, well, the only reason these other people do the qualitative stuff is because they can't do the math. They can't handle the numbers. And so after that sort of ridiculous debate went on for a couple of decades, by the last couple of decades of the 20th century, maybe the last third of the 20th century, we began to realize that these are two different approaches to answering different questions. If we don't know an awful lot about something and we need to understand it better, and we need to understand, you know, what the variables are and what the factors are and what might be relationships that we don't know yet, that lends itself to very much a qualitative approach, a very inductive approach. If we have an idea of a relationship and we know what the variables are and we say, okay, we think if we do this, something will happen here, then that lends itself to a very deductive quantitative approach. And so it's not like you can take a problem and apply either approach. It depends upon the questions you need to answer. And so in the 20th century into the 21st century, we have begun to realize that most research that is very productive involves a combination of those elements. And certainly when you're doing action research in a school or impact research in a school or whatever, it demands to have multiple sources of data, demands to have quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches. And so that's kind of where we are. Questions, thoughts, comments? Don't really care at this point. It's too late. Just being honest. Yeah, it's late for me too. But, you know, I think that's why we will limit these meetings to generally no more than an hour. It might go a little bit longer than an hour, but probably not. And we won't be meeting every week with these, although we will meet next week.
So as we submit our ideas, are you going to help us narrow down?
Oh, yeah.
down. Okay.
Yeah. I'm generally going to not discourage an idea. I might try to direct it, encourage you to go in a particular direction or steer you away from things that I think are probably not feasible, not really, won't be very productive for you to get into. You just won't find much or something like that. So it's that'll be the nature of kind of the feedback that I'll do. If you've got more than one idea, yeah, feel free to offer a couple, 3 ideas, and more than a statement, paragraph or so, or a short paragraph about it. And I'll react and give you an idea of, this one's good, this one's also good, this one really stinks, maybe better language than that. Okay, I'll give you a rationale for that. But I want the choices to be as much yours as I can make them. And so I'll try to nudge you one way or the other, steer you, but that would be the kind of feedback I'll give you.
Are you looking more for like test score improvements, or say our school may have low parent involvement?
Yeah.
Or would you rather it be towards more like, improving EOG scores?
Well, it can be in either direction. I don't have really a preference one way or the other. I mean, you can go after things that will improve the structure and the climate within the school. Obviously, parent involvement would be a big part of that. You can go after things that might have an impact on summative outcomes. Although, once again, I discourage you to not depend strictly on summative outcomes to measure, how well something is going, because there are just too many balls in the air in a school to understand that, one thing is going to have this impact on that. And so, yeah, you can provide summative stuff to measure the overall movement in an overall goal. But I would prefer that even if you're talking about an impact on summative outcomes, on EOG scores, that whatever the intervention is, you have some sort of interim data points in there too. And most of the interventions that are out there do. I mean, they have formative data points. May even have formative assessment pieces to them. And so, that sort of data is really the heart and soul of understanding whether a particular intervention is working or not. But yeah, I don't have, you can look at the whole school, you can look at a class, you can look at the climate of a school, the structure of a school. I mean, all these are open. I'll try to, focus you a little bit, but I won't steer you away from, what seems like a reasonable idea. I know it probably bothers you that I'm not giving you perfect examples right off the bat, but yeah, I don't, I just don't. I like, I like people to be creative and thoughtful and things like that. All right, folks. No other questions or other comments or thoughts? If you have questions or whatever, be sure just to email me or something, and we'll sort it out. Otherwise, I'll see you next week at roughly 7:30. Have a good evening and have a good week.